and she has a vast area of academic interests, but a few of them include gender studies, migration, diaspora, and urban sociology. She's actually the author of the book, Negotiating Identities, Women in the Indian Diaspora. And her PhD, she has done her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh and postdoctoral from the University of Princeton. So she is, I think, one of the best people to chair this session, to moderate this session, and I welcome again Saaz Agarwal and Subhadra Anand to this session. And it is for all of us to value and know the importance of Sindhi culture and identity. And ma'am, with that, madam, I'll give the stage to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. A very warm welcome to a panel on Sindhi identity and culture at the HLF showcasing Sindhi as the language for this year. I think that we need to understand the whole idea of migration and the concept of home through the Sindhis. Once we understand Sindhis, as a child growing up in Sikandrabad, it was a very normal thing to have several Sindhis in the class in our convent school, and we always associated with them with, the strong cultural bonds that they grew up with, the identities and the need to actually move, from place to place while creating a belongingness. That was very, very important. The other thing that I noticed as I grew up and became a sociologist was the Sindhis are a group where even in stories of partition, when we are trying to visibilize those that are invisible, the Sindhis were further invisibilized. So I think there was a historicity that was missing. And our partition stories, of course, when we look at the stories of Butalia, speaking of women, it was something that came much later in the 80s, almost 40 years after. There are several stories like that come about, and I think I'm going to be very, very, honored here to be able to hear from people who have been working on this. I'm going to introduce our panelists. Dr. Subhadra Anand was born in Hyderabad, Sindh, educated in Delhi, and worked as a lecturer and college principal in Mumbai. She was the CEO of Save the Children of India. Her National Integration of Sindhis is a book that continues to be a seminal reference work, and her novel, Tryst with Koki, quite new in 2023, traces a post-partition journey of survival, sustenance and strength. Her vision for a cultural center for Sindhis in India was realized with Jhulelal Teerth Dham, a cultural complex in Narayan Sarovar in Kutch at the mouth of the Arabian Sea. And that will soon house a museum and an amphitheatre alongside the magnificent Jhulelal temple. So I think Subhadra ji has been, working very, very hard on making the invisible visible, and also presenting the, in some ways, the lost culture. We have also with us Saaz Agarwal. She's a writer and independent researcher, but she taught mathematics at Ruparel College and was a features editor at Times of India. So journalism, our journalism is very much part of what she does. She wrote poetry and columns for national and print media for more than 20 years, mostly humor, parody and nonsense, she says, with a long stretch on books for the Sunday Midday. She started writing books in 2006 and has published biographies, corporate histories and family chronicles. Her books on Sindh are in the libraries of global universities and have featured in literature festivals and conferences in India, Pakistan and the United Kingdom. Her paintings and mixed media collections are held by collectors worldwide and corporate offices in India. I think that, it's an absolute beautiful kind of work that Saaz does and her book on home and homelessness, which I just had the privilege of seeing, is heard, the story is heard through the voice of her mother, which I think is very, very strong there. And it's an illustrated work and also available here. So we have two very different contributions to the Sindhi world. But I would like to begin by asking the question about partition. How does, Sindh and how do the Sindhis figure in the partition? Maybe we begin with Subhadra.
Thank you, Aparna. And it's a privilege to be over here and to tell you about the Sindhi experiences. Now, one thing is there, and that is like Aparna said, that as far as the partition narratives are concerned, the Sindhis have been rather invisible. I think that is the reason being that as far as Punjab and Bengal is concerned, there was lot of, I would not say drama, but there was lot of, bloodshed, riots, violence, something that was so gory and unfortunate that came into the forefront. And the Sindhis were literally not taken into consideration that they suffered the most. Why I am saying they suffered the most is because they lost their homeland completely. Sindh was totally given away to Pakistan, whereas Bengal and Punjab were divided and given to East and West as far as India and Pakistan were concerned. So there was a continuity for them, but as far as Sindhis were concerned, there was no continuity. And why is it that the narratives are silent about Sindhis? And that is because the Sindhis, the migration or displacement did not have the riots and the trauma. But I would go one step further and say, compare that as far as Punjab and Bengal is concerned, it was a jhatka. But as far as Sindh was concerned, it was a halal. The reason that I am saying jhatka for Punjab and this is because the Punjabis and Bengalis knew the riots are taking place, they have to flee. As far as Sindhis were concerned, why am I saying that it was a halal? Because it was a slow movement. Sindh government kept on telling the Sindhis, don't worry, don't leave, because the economy was in the hands of Sindhi Hindus. So the Sindh government kept on telling the Sindhi Hindus that nothing is going to happen to you. You hold the key to the economy, so you rest. Your land has not been taken away and nothing is going to happen to you. So the Sindhis were very, very hopeful, and added to that was that there was excellent relationship between the Hindus and Muslims. But slowly and slowly events started turning. Why I am saying halal? Because there were instances, I don't want to go into all that, but before the riots took place, slowly and slowly and slowly, the rights of the Sindhi Hindus were being taken away, their land was being taken away, taxes were being imposed to them, and that is why slow signals were being given to them. Ultimately, the Karachi riots and the Hyderabad riots took place where they had to leave. In fact, the Sindh government themselves told them that you leave because now there is going to be a new rule that is going to come up, and the Islamic rule of Jinnah and the Orthodoxy is coming. That was the central government, and the Sindhis slowly had to put locks on their houses, hoping to return, but there was no return for them. And they left their land, they left their property, they left everything, and they came away to India. So I was just wondering, one thing was there, and that was, why was not even a piece of land given to Sindhis? I'll come to that little later on because I'll hand over now Saaz.
Thank you, Aparna. I really like the word you used, invisible, because it's really very striking in partition narratives. You don't see Sindhi at all. And along with invisible, I think you need another word which is called all pervasive, because you see Sindhis everywhere. And I'm not just talking about in Hyderabad, not just talking about in India, but all over the world. We'll talk about that later. But when it comes to partition, I think I will tell you two stories from the oral histories I've collected, and they're both coming from outside Sindh. They're perspectives of non-Sindhis. One is actually not an oral history, it was a letter which was sent by somebody. Soon after my first book, Stories from a Vanished Homeland, was published in 2012, a Sindhi lady came across it and she bought it for a number of her friends. And this lady had grown up in Kolkata, sorry. And she wrote back saying that, this reminded me of the many Sindhi people I'd known. And one of them was a seller of saris. And he would visit our home every few months. And he would then show us the collection, and they were some of the choicest saris. I'm using same words that she wrote in her letter. She said they were some of the choicest saris that my mother had seen. And my mother, he was a gentleman, so my mother would give him tea and he'd show the saris, she would buy some. And after several months, he came and he said, this is going to be my last visit. And it turned out that he was actually a skin specialist in Sindh, and he had come with nothing, and he had now earned enough through selling saris door to door to set up he bought into a practice with a skin specialist in Calcutta. The other story comes from soon after partition in Agra, and it was told to me by Mr. Dubey, whom I interviewed. He was in the second batch of Bits Pilani, and he was at home for the holidays, and his father was a social worker in Agra, and he said that the city was full of refugees. And my father would go and, he'd help in the camps. And one day he brought a Sindhi family home. And there was this man and his wife and the man's mother and their 7-year-old son. And they had come with nothing. He said we gave them a little corner in our veranda, and they had baths, and they had to wear the same, we washed their clothes and wore the same clothes again because we weren't carrying anything. And the man went to the wholesale market and he bought a big sack of grain, and he carried it himself to the retail section, and he sat down on a pavement and started selling the grain at a lower rate than what the shopkeepers were selling it at. And pretty soon, of course, the sack was empty. So then he sold the sack, and then he went and got another one. So what Mr. Dubey told me is, on the third day, we did not have to feed them anymore. And I think, even when I say this now, it makes my hair stand up, because this is just so intrinsic to how the Sindhis coped with partition. In the process, of course, they lost so much. They lost much more than their material possessions, which they very quickly gained back. This gentleman who the story that I told you about, they now apparently own a shoe factory, they own shoe factories in Kanpur. The other thing I want to quickly tell you about this story is that when I told somebody about it, and she's somebody very close to me and a Sindhi herself, she said, but he only told you that because he knows that you're collecting Sindhi stories. What's so great about it? And that's what made me realize that people know what the Sindhis went through, Sindhis know what they went through, but they don't think it's a big deal at all. They just have it's in part of their family, and fine, that's what happened. They didn't realize, partly, as Subhadra said, it was the lack of violence, the lack of drama, the lack of killing, because Sindh was more peaceful. But partly it was also because, they felt, I've heard this all the time, we were the lucky ones. So there was that comparison. But partly they just took it for, they just took it as it came and they kept going.
Yeah, I was thinking, let me put a slightly different spin on this. And I think when we're talking about forced migration, there is a concept of rebuilding with resilience. And I think when we speak of rebuilding with resilience, can you take us through that process of, actually moving, creating a new home? So home is no longer, there is an ideal home. It's not the word exile that we use like we use for the Jews, but there's definitely a sense of belonging and there is a home. But what about the whole process of rebuilding and the resilience with which the communities, I will say in the plural, because different contexts, different places around the world have different things. But what would you say about this process of rebuilding?
I think the entire narrative of Sindhi identity is rested on this, the process. Now, like I told you that for Sindhis, it was not a, planned thing or anything. It came as a shock because they knew and they were hoping that things in Sindh would improve. And those were the assurances given by the government as well as their fellow Sindhis. But suddenly they had to leave after the riots of Karachi and Hyderabad. Where did they have to go? And naturally, wherever they, they had to run. And Karachi became a central point of running. It was a safe place to go because once you boarded a ship, then there were no riots in between and no killings in between. There were two ways how the Sindhis came. One was from a train in Hyderabad to Rajasthan, and the other one was Karachi to Bombay. Now I am dealing with Karachi to Bombay. The moment they came to Bombay, they were huddled into trucks and taken into a military camp in Ulhasnagar, which was miles away, 40 kilometers away from Bombay. A camp which was barracks, which was deserted because it was occupied by the British soldiers, and they left after World War II. So here was this camp that was there with nothing. Nothing means nothing. And the Sindhis, who were a prosperous community, like I told you that the entire 40% of the economy in Sindh was in their hands, and they had palatial houses, etc. Here they were stripped of everything and put into barracks. And there were no privacy, no toilets, nothing, but I won't go into that part of it. But the life began from there. Initially they felt that they will go back to Sindh because there is always a hope. But soon they realized that this was going to be their life. There was no going back. So one thing that they had to take care of, and that was livelihood. What livelihood can they have in the camp? Initially, there were the camp commanders, it was being run by the army, and they were given doles, etc. But it was humiliating for them to stand in queues for, their grains, etc. But in any case, they did have to accept because of survival. But each and every one of them had this thing, no, I have to become independent. And it was the women in the camps who started small bakeries, and they started making biscuits, etc. And the little boys, their children would go and sell that in the trains. Their men started going to Ambernath, the factories where they started exploring that what can we do as far as business is concerned. Everything was what business are we going to do, because Sindhis are a business community. And that is how they started, slowly and slowly. Like Saaz said, that they didn't want the doles, they wanted to become independent. So the women started making papads, kacharis and biscuits, etc. which were being sold by small boys, their children in the trains. So soon we find that from Ambernath factories, etc., the men learned that, okay, this is what is needed, and they started making that in the barracks. So Sindhi business is always a business where they see what is the need and then fulfill the need. So that is why the best example was the fountain pens. They realized that fountain pens need that tube. So the tube was the one that was being made in the camp. Soon Ulhasnagar became a center of small scale industry. Today also you go to Ulhasnagar, is full of industry. So that is how they came up. The livelihood kept their eyes and ears open. Wherever there was an opportunity, they went ahead with it, and single-handedly, with their own efforts, they managed to survive. That was the livelihood part of it, but it was at the cost of culture and the trauma, and I think that was.
Yes. Aparna mentioned the word exile, and you said, I think it's very relevant. Exile is a very relevant word for this community because they had a homeland and they could never go back. And I think that does actually, I think exile is a good word for that. Can you hear? So I said that exile I think is a good word because it does describe what happened to the community, and in fact, Nandita Bhavnani's book is actually called The Making of Exile, which I totally agree with. So when it comes to, as Subhadra said, it is largely a mercantile community, and most of the families kind of rehabilitated through trade. But there were also many who were not. They come from the educated family, the educated part of the community, which are the Amils. And for them, education was extremely important, and when they were relocated to different places, and I'm thinking of people I've spoken to who grew up in refugee camps in Bombay. Basically, they started the same schools that they had left behind. And some of them actually were able to carry documents. In those days, printing was not like it is today. So they were able to bring the report cards, and I've seen things like that. They brought them. There was a famous case of Professor Kundunani, who Dr. Anand knew very well, and she was a successor principal of the college which he started in Bombay. He was a professor at a college in Hyderabad, Sindh, and when things became really bad and he knew he had to leave, he decided to take his college with him. And he packed 2 trunks with textbooks and laboratory equipment, and he got them across the border. And technically, of course, that was smuggling, but he knew he had to do it because the college was completely abandoned, and for at least 20 years, nothing happened there. Eventually, of course, it was restored, and today it's a running college which has, honor boards with the names of all the principals that college had. In Bombay, as a refugee, Professor Kundunani walked the streets every day looking for a good location. He connected with the wealthy Sindhis of his community, and he built the college, he built National College. And there were other similar stories that came out from this refugee community. The other thing I wanted to say, along with exile, is that there was a huge scattering which we just haven't yet been able to understand. It was a scattering that had so much of velocity, so much of, I don't know what words to use, but the kind of energy that it had, it just drove everything else away. The language was lost. We're going to talk about that later, I think. But, people just became different. They were separated. There was no way to build a common narrative. And one of the things which you may know is that the Sindhis are actually all around the world, and that diaspora was not a consequence of partition particularly. It had actually started more than 100 years before partition, right? So this happened soon after the British conquered Sindh, and that was like actually an annexation which was very, very illegal because they had all these treaties of eternal friendship, but they walked in with their guns, and that was that. Now, for the traders of Sindh, it was a very difficult time having new masters. They'd lost their customers, they'd lost their suppliers, and everything was gone. They realized that the British are very keen buyers of Sindhi handicrafts, and they started dealing in those handicrafts. They pretty soon hopped onto steamships, taking them from Bombay to Aden and Cairo and Gibraltar and Las Palmas and Punta Arenas and on the east to the Strait settlements and so on. And by the 1860s, they had set up retail establishments all over in the British ports all around the world. There's this French researcher called Claude Markowitz who documented this, and his work was actually only published in 1999-2000. So, he stumbled across this. Again, we're talking about invisible. People, nobody knew. It was there. Of course, the Sindhis knew because, the young boys were going out to work in other countries and there was money pouring into the province.
Yeah, I think a number of themes have come in the last conversation, but what I would like to focus on, I think, is whether it's in the diaspora, because the Sindhi diaspora is spread across several countries, and one talks about the cosmopolitan connections, as Falzon said, but I am interested in the cultural reproduction that Subhadra ji was going to refer to, and I also, wanted to see whether, among several diaspora, you look at the women as the keepers of the community. In the traditional patriarchal sense, they bear the burden of culture. If there is language, you say, the whole critique comes on the woman, what was the mother doing in that sense. But in my own work on the diaspora, I do find that the cultural reproduction is also done with the consciousness, with the raising of consciousness about worrying about the next generation. How does one really talk about the culture and how does it go? So what does this mean? What does culture mean? And what is the role of women who are very, very strong they are very strong in building the finances of the community as well as the culture of the community. So would you give us a glimpse of that?
Yeah, talking of culture, now if we look at the process that you were talking about of the Sindhis, the first process was livelihood. How are we going to survive? And that was the first priority. Culture was put in the back burner because there was the survival factor that was there. And this culture being in the back burner stayed in the back burner for quite some time. And when you look at communities entering into other societies, now we know that Sindhis were a scattered community. They were all over India and they were all over the world. So their host country had, or host state had, its own language, its own culture, everything, and here was a migrant community, displaced community superimposed on them. Now the point is that if at that stage the Sindhis had no concept of how to maneuver themselves as far as the new equation is concerned, the result of this was that Sindhis undermined their own culture, they undermined their own language, and they started adapting to the host culture, adapting to the host language. Now that was something that was accepted by the host society, and their livelihood and their businesses increased. But the casualty was the culture. Now we know that there are 3 stages of migrants that they go through. One is adjustment, So the Sindhis had to make this adjustment. Second one was assimilation. Soon the Sindhis started becoming, and they were being assimilated into the host society, where their own culture and language was in the background, and they started adapting the language and the culture of the host society. Third, up to here it was okay, but the third stage is absorption. Absorption is when your culture is completely finished off and taken over by the host culture. This is the danger that Sindhis are going through today. Assimilation level, it was fine because it led to acceptance, and their businesses started doing well because they learned the language, etc. But now the threat is on their language and on their culture. Sindhis, in fact, are being seen as people without any culture because they are continuously adapting themselves to whatever host society. So if you look at it, a Sindhi in Gujarat is different from a Sindhi in Punjab or a Sindhi in Bombay, because Bombay Sindhis are believing in Ganpati. Your Bengali Sindhis are believing in Durga. So that is the thing, and identity is of two kinds: fluid identity and core identity. Fluid identity is up to the assimilation level, where you change your pattern and things like that, take on the dresses, custom, that is superficial. But core identity is when your language is at stake and when your religion is at stake. So that is the thing that today we are facing that. Sindhis are facing that because acquisitions, because I'll just give you an instance. Since I'm a teacher, in my class there was a student who came up to me. I always quote this example because it was life-changing for me. He came up to me and he said, "Madam, don't you have your own Ishtadev? Don't you have your own God? Why are the Sindhis in Maharashtra following Ganpati? And why are they now, even if they are following Ganpati, they are not following Ganpati in the same tradition. But I am very intrigued that Sindhis don't have their own God. We find them, in everywhere without, having a rudder." And I, of course, gave him this thing, no, Sindhis are cosmopolitan, they believe in everything. But it led me into a thought. And that is that we are forgetting everything about our culture. And who is that God who identifies completely with Sindhi, and that is Jhulelal. And Jhulelal was somebody who was dedicated into the background. And that is where we are as far as today.
Saaz, if you can also bring art into this.
Aparna, you started by asking about women as the keepers of memory. So I wanted to say that, when people started writing about and speaking about Sindhis, documenting the histories, we were all women. This started about 12-15 years ago with Nandita Bhavnani and Rita Kothari, and then a bunch of us followed. Of course, Subhadra's work was the earliest. She did her PhD on the national integration of Sindhis. And then Menka Shakasani, Anjum Akhija. There are many other younger ones now who are doing fabulous work, mostly women. And I also feel that my journey, the trigger was actually a gift, which was memories from my mother, who was 13 years old when partition took place. And the things she told me, which she had retained without speaking about them for 65 years, I think that is a tremendous thing which happened. But when it comes to actually looking at what culture is, and I realized this quite recently, when I noticed the difference between the influencers on social media, Sindhis in India and the Sindhis of Sindh. And the Sindhis of India, the topics are mostly facetious. They deal with, the drudgery of housework and the angst of a young boy who's being dragged to the family dukaan when he actually wants to go and sing on the beach. And they're very good quality and huge numbers of followers, but this is the content. Whereas the Sindhis of Sindh, and I should also tell you that Sindhis of Sindh had their own trauma after partition because a new population came in and they were colonized, their language was rejected, and they were, I've been told that I was told by a Sindhi of Sindh, a Sindhi Muslim, that we were told you are good for nothing but to feed grass to your donkeys. So for them, culture means something else. It means reviving the music and the art. And if you look at these influencers, you will see so much beauty in what they are showing. They are showing, things. Of course, Sindh, if you look at art in Sindh, you can go back to Mohenjo-daro, where you have the pottery and you have the bronze statues, and you have these famous things that we know, which we have seen through the ages. There's a lot of rock art, there's a lot of carvings and stupas and menhirs and dolmens and hero stones, all kinds of things. And of course, these tell us that the inhabitants of those places were Zoroastrian, Hindus, Buddhists and Jains. And of course, you also have the necropolises of the Islamic world. But coming close to the current day, which is just before partition, during the British occupation, what came to light was the tiling and the elaborate pottery and enameling. Closer to partition were the buildings, the architecture, the architectural flourishes of the buildings, the colors, and those buildings still stand today, and you'll be interested to know that in Pakistan today, they're called Hindu architecture. And of course, that is such an interesting phrase. You wonder, is this architecture that refuses to eat cows, or does it have a terrible caste system or what? But it's actually a nice phrase as well, because it's a tribute to the Hindus who built those homes before partition. And as I told you, there was a lot of trade by them, and there was a lot of money coming in, and they left behind those lovely old Havelis, which are now, it's referred to as Hindu architecture. I'm not sure if I covered your question, but I think I spoke for quite long.
Yes. No, I think I'll just do one more question and then I open it up after that. And this is more in terms of ideas of multiple homelands. And there is also, I think, a positive in thinking about Kolkata or Mumbai as home, or Sindh in a different way for the contemporary generation. I think because listening to the stories is one thing, living there is another. So how does memory and how does memory get handed down with the nostalgia of the parents, and now I think it's much more a contemporary belongingness. So if you could just reflect on that, both of you, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Multiple homelands, that's a very nice way of putting it. The moment you say multiple homelands, what does it reflect? It reflects on the mobility of the Sindhis, the ability to go anywhere, and they are the ones who have the will, the strength to go to any part of the world and to make that their homeland. So that is what is the multiple homes. So you will find, even in Indira Gandhi went to Iceland and she found a Sindhi over there. I went to Alaska and found a Sindhi shop over there. So every corner is inhabited by Sindhi business people who make that in their homeland, and their sons marry somebody from Spain. So Spain is the homeland. They get a daughter-in-law from New Zealand, and New Zealand is homeland. So here you find they have become a global community. As far as their homeland is concerned, world is their homeland. They have attachments to different types of land. They are not scared to move out. They are not scared to go anywhere because they have lost their land. And once having lost their land, they are recreating their homes anywhere and attaching them. So I love that, I remember that multiple homes. So diaspora, Sindhi diaspora is multiple homes.
So I think what I'll talk about, Klee, is the feeling of nostalgia that Sindhis have for places that they have never been to and they will never go to. And you know, when you say Hyderabad, of course we are in Hyderabad now, but when you say Hyderabad, Sindh, for me that's the place my mother was born and where she, you know, grew up. Partition took place and then they lost everything. If you talk about Sakhar or Rohini or Shikarpur, any Sindhi, you know, the minute they hear the name of the place where their family came from, there's a certain feeling which I cannot describe to you, but you can try it out and see what happens. I'll just quickly tell you about this thing that happened to me when I was in Gibraltar, and this again was when I was on a book tour with my first book. And I spoke to a group of Sindhi, of about 80 Sindhis, and they, I gave them a presentation about what I'd learned and what went into the book. And at the end of the talk, somebody said, I would like to share something with you. So he stood up and he said, you know, when I was young, I thought that all Indians were Sindhis. So everybody laughed. But it was true, because in Gibraltar, all the Indians were Sindhis. And then, of course, being in Gibraltar, it's a British territory, so you get, in those days at least, you got to go to uni, so he went to uni. And there, he said this, he met for the first time Indians from other parts of the country. And he said, you know, people would say to me, I'm from Delhi. What about you? Or I'm from Gujarat, or I'm from Bombay. And he'd say, I'm a Sindhi. And they'd say, oh, if you see a Sindhi and a snake, who should you kill? So, all those 80 people burst out laughing again. Now, it's nice to be able to laugh at yourself and, you know, not feel insulted by something like that. And I do know that this thing about the Sindhi and the snake, or the Brahmin and the snake, I mean, it's very common in India. But I came across that same thing again when I was putting together Sindhi Tapestry, which is a collection of essays on the Sindhi identity by many people. In fact, I got 59 essays, mine was the 60th, and it was a very broad group, some in their 20s, we had one in his 90s. They were from all over the world, and different backgrounds. Some were artists, many were business people, many were academics. 4 of them mentioned the Sindhi and the snake. So maybe that's also something that, you know, you can take home with you and see what you can do with it.
Thank you. Well, I'll open it up now. I see a couple of hands. The young man with glasses, middle, who I saw first.
Hello. Thank you so much for the session, ma'am. We can go back more informed and speak to our Sindhi friends, with a bit of more information. Thanks for addressing the last point. My question is actually on that. Though Dalits are minorities and tribes have it worse when it comes to gross generalizations and caste slurs, one of the non-Dalit and non-tribal community that had many caste slurs and gross generalizations, which are even now used in our colloquial, is the Sindhi community, which is very unfortunate. Where do you think this has started from, why it has started and why is it persisting? It is definitely a generalization and
very difficult. Good question, but very difficult to answer. One thing I should tell you is that I have read prejudicial remarks about Sindhis 100 years before partition, because a lot of the British colonials were also referring to how stupid the Sindhis were. Sorry about that, but that's something that I've read. Richard Burton, for example. Now, when it comes to partition, what happened is, I told you about the gentleman who sat down with the sack and was selling at a lower price than people around him. Now, obviously, the people around him are just not going to be very happy with what he's doing, and that's the the root of possibly Sindhis being called cheats and, you know, very shrewd and money-minded. But yeah, I mean, I don't think I can say much more. Every community, there's a bell curve of human behavior, right? Everybody, and there are certain characteristics which are very strong in the Sindhi community, such as, you know, if you were to look at stereotypes, on the positive side, you'd have hardworking, entrepreneurial, resilient. I mean, we're also proud of having those in our genes. I think I'll just stop with that.
Yeah, we'll take a couple of questions and then respond maybe that way with the audience. Yeah.
Good afternoon. This is a question, actually, I need some. Till recently, we only hear of refugees. And yesterday, in one of the sessions here, we met Manoranjan Vyapari, who talked about being a Dalit and what happened to him when he came to India from Bengal, that is East Bengal to West Bengal. What is the Dalit experience, Sindhi Dalit experience? Please shed some light on that.
Another question there in the orange. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Professor Rayaprol. Thank you for hosting this. I have a question for Saaz ji. So, in your episode with Amit Verma, you made a distinction between a lost homeland and a vanished homeland. And lost homeland was the term your mother preferred, and you preferred a vanished homeland, I think.
Lost homeland, sorry, can I just take that quickly before going back to that? Just 2 minutes. Lost homeland was the word used by Oxford University Press, and they said that, oh, the Sindhis are not going to like it if we say that their homeland vanished. Which I vanished was actually not my mother's choice of words, but it was what happened. What I realized had happened to her, because as a child, she couldn't see, you know, she didn't have any concept of a map when the village of her forefathers was there. So it was word vanished. But Oxford University Press, they changed the name of the title and they called it The Lost Homeland. Thanks for listening to that very long podcast.
So what was the usage of these terms? It pointed to an imagination of the homeland, right? So I was just wondering, how is the current generation, say maybe people around my age, how are they imagining this homeland? Are there ballads of trauma or memory? Maybe not that of partition, but the loss of a homeland and a language and a culture still. How is that going?
Yeah, thank you. And you can answer both.
The Dalit question is, I think most of the Sindhi Dalits are still in Sindh. No, Sindh is still full of, and they are mostly Dalits, which, and they were in probably rural areas. They did not migrate. I don't have any actual data to give you, but I can tell you that Sindhis say very proudly that we never had a caste system, and I think that's probably true because most of the upper caste Sindhis migrated. And I heard about the Dalits for the first time at a conference, and there were 3 papers from Sindh talking about the Dalits, and that's when I realized that I didn't know what they're talking about. So that's, and then to come back to your question about the younger generation, that's a really difficult question. I think they also feel that they lost something terrible. They just realized that they are realizing that they were never informed about something that they were linked to, and then, you know, slowly the treasures are unraveling. I know many of them want to visit, but most people do not want to associate themselves with what is unfortunately, seen as an enemy country, and that's really unfortunate. But still, people have a feeling for Sindh, people have a feeling for what was lost, and I think many young people now, because the struggle for sustenance is no longer such a strong issue, there can be time and energy used in exploring understanding.
Actually, as far as the younger generation is concerned, the older generation is really worried about it, because after they go, who's going to take the mantle of the language? Because the language as such, if you find, the younger generation is not speaking Sindhi. Even the generation after 47, the strangest part of it was that when they left, the Sindhis left and they, settled everywhere in India, it was expected that the grandmothers would at least speak Sindhi to the grandchildren. But it became an ironical thing that the grandmothers learned Hindi and they started talking in Hindi to the grandchildren. So that Sindhi connect was completely gone. And now we feel that whenever 5 or 6 Sindhis meet, it's very tragic that we all speak in English. But if you see 5 or 6 Maharashtrians meeting or Tamil meeting, they are speaking in their own language. So our homeland was lost, and with the homeland, our language was lost. And we have now to make very strong efforts in order to keep the language alive. And by all means, another problem that, just 2 minutes, historically also we find that Sindhi has become a victim of script. Sindhi was written in 2 scripts, one was Devanagari and one was Arabic. In Sindh it was written in Arabic, all the literature is in Arabic, Shah Abdul Latif Sachar, all the poets have written in Arabic. But will the younger generation learn Arabic? It's so and then that is why one section of Sindhis said let's adapt it and have Devanagari script. Now the older school felt no, why Devanagari? It has to be Arabic. Now the third is that why don't we have Roman script? So the script has also made our language very weak. I would say that whatever is the script, we have to first keep our spoken language alive. Let's keep the spoken language alive and then we will take on the script. Not to worry about the script. If you are learning it in Roman, learn it in Roman. Devanagari, learn it in Devanagari, Arabic. But speak in Sindhi. We are not speaking in. ऐं मां सिंधी थी करे चई थी सघां कि ॾाढी ख़राबु ॻाल्हि आहे कि असीं सिंधी नथा ॻाल्हायूं 4-5 फ्रेंड्स सां बि मिलूं त असीं इंग्लिश में था ॻाल्हायूं. We have to speak in Sindhi. At least let's keep the spoken Sindhi alive.
I think we should also say a very big thank you to the Hyderabad Literature Festival for showcasing Sindhi, because it's something that has never been done before. There's nobody who's ever really said, yes, Sindhi is a thing. So a very big thank you to the festival.
I think language, but one interesting thing I'd like to say that, we know that the British were past masters in divide and rule. They in fact have conquered India over the policy of divide and rule. When I was doing my research, I went to the archives and I was surprised to see the lettering that Her Majesty's government believes in divide and rule. Let us divide the Sindhis on the script. At that time, so there was a Captain Stack who devised the Devanagari script and said all Hindus must go to schools which are running Devanagari script. All Muslims will go to schools which are running Arabic school, which was run by Burton. So these were the two people, Burton and Stack, who divided the country. But Sindhis are very smart as far as opportunity is concerned. Sindh was, as such, using the Arabic as the official language. So all Sindhi Hindus rejected the Devanagari script and they went to Arabic script and they learned the Arabic script. But now that we are in India, there is danger, like I said, all 3 scripts are in danger, so we just stick to the spoken language.
Yeah, I think language is one of the bedrocks of maintaining culture. Yes, religion, art, and I think preservation is very, very important. But I also feel that probably the tradition of oral history is something that is very, very strong among Sindhis, as is among other diasporic communities. So I think now we have reached a stage where we keep those records much better. So I'm sure that technology will help, recreate some of these traditions and preserve them better for the future generations. Yeah, I must say that we did not go over time. We started late, so I will maybe. I'm sorry, I don't think I can open it up to questions, but you can definitely meet them and interact with them. I think you want to say. I'll have the panelists have one last word each as well, please.
Okay, just one thing I would like to share with you, and that is my vision, the vision that I have for the Sindhis. You know, when I was doing my PhD, I did intensive research on how the scattered communities keep their culture alive. And then I saw that Sikhs, the Sardar community, Sikhs anywhere in the world are uniting as far as Golden Temple is concerned. Every Sikh has to go to Golden Temple. Every Muslim has to go to Makkah, Medina. Every Parsi has to go to Navsari. So these are the pilgrimage places which hold the community together when it is a scattered community. So as part of that, my research said that all Sindhis must unite under Jhulelal, who is the deity of the Sindhis, and with the help of quite a few philanthropic Sindhis, we have in Narayan Sarovar, in Kutch, because Kutch has got Sindhi language, etc., we have developed a very big pilgrimage center for for Jhulelal, and it's still going on, but it's a dream where all Sindhis, 73 acres of land, where all Sindhis from all over the world should converge over there, and they should bond together as one community. So Jhulelal Teej Dham was my vision, was my dream, and now it has become reality. And I thought I'd share it with you as something that is going to become the repository of Sindhi culture.
Thank you so much to both panelists who have been working very, very hard to preserve the idea of Sindhi identity and culture. Thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, all of you, for listening to us patiently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saaz ma'am and Subhadra ma'am. Over the last few days, I feel like I have learned so much about Sindhi language and culture, and I have my, juniors and colleagues from my batchmates from my university asking, I want to read Sindhi literature, where should I start? And all that. So this has been like a great opportunity for all of us to learn about a language, a culture that we all must know about, because it is essential as Indians that we do not forget and ignore our roots. So thank you so much.